Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and tonight we're going to look at the very early history of Worcester. We are lucky to live in Worcester purely because Worcester has seen all the great events, the big chapters in the history of Britain, but also in some cases the history of the world as well. So we have looked in the past at Georgian Worcester, for example. We've even had a look at medieval Worcester, and if you click on the playlist on our page here, you'll be able to click on Worcester or Worcester history, something along those words, and you'll be able to bring up all those chapters. Now, we can't go into every bit of detail, for example, on medieval Worcester, or like this evening on the early history of Worcester, but hopefully it will give you a nice little topic starter that you'll be able to watch and then research in your own time, or maybe go to the library and get a good book on the topic, or have a look online. There may be some information on there. I know if you have a look, for example, on the Explore the Past website, which is run by Worcestershire Archive and Archaeology Service, there's a lot of information on there. So these videos are not to be concise topic videos. They are starters. They're brief overviews as such, really. So tonight we're not going to talk about medieval Worcester. We're going to talk about the very early history of Worcester, and it is a topic that I find absolutely fascinating. Now, if you look at the history of the world, our world has gone through many climatic changes over the years, really. We've had hot periods, we've had freezing cold periods, and we've had periods which are often referred to as the snowball effect, where the earth is completely white because it's completely covered in ice. And they are often referred to as the ice ages. And it's interesting because some people actually state today that because we've still got ice on the north and south poles, for example, technically we are still coming out of the ice age. We're not out of it yet. So it is quite interesting. You also need to remember that we've had mini ice ages as well. You could say the blast from the past, or the beast from the east, I think it was called, words to that effect anyway, that we had a couple of years ago. But we know, for example, in the 17th century, there was a mini ice age then as well, caused by volcanic eruptions in other parts of the world, really. So our climate has been going hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold for centuries and centuries. But we're not bothered about those individual climatic episodes. We're really concentrating on what happened after the last ice age, the last well-known ice age that some people, like I said, reckon that we're still coming out of. Now, years ago, before that last ice age, the River Severn, this is absolutely fascinating, never used to flow from the north south into the Bristol Channel. It's interesting because the River Severn originally used to flow north and then out into the Dee estuary, and I find that absolutely fascinating, really. But when we do get this last ice age that comes along, that last ice age completely freezes the bulk of the northern hemisphere. Really, it doesn't actually go all the way over, but the northern hemisphere. And we actually know the glaciers encroached right down to what is today known as Wolverhampton. Now that meant that anyone living in Worcestershire, or shall we say moving through, because technically they didn't stick in one place for very long, you were really on the edge of habitable land. If you move north of Wolverhampton, you're then on the massive glaciers, and you are walking through snow and ice and freezing temperatures all day, all year round. And there's no way you could sustain life. No way life could be sustained in that area, really. Even animal life, you won't really find anything there. It's too cold. But when you have this ice age that ends at Wolverhampton, the area of Worcestershire is right on that edge, what we would probably say is the frontier, really, of habitable land. And that glacier actually stops the River Severn flowing out into the Dee estuary. So what did Worcester look like at the time? Well, that is a map that I use when we do our guided tours. It's actually the first map I used just to describe the landscape at that time. And there's the River Severn. So it's now changed direction, and the reason for that is the glaciers up at Wolverhampton. And what is left behind is a completely scoured out landscape. And we know at that end of the last ice age, this whole landscape would have been quite tundra. So you would have had bits of snow dotted around. We would have had snow definitely in the winter time, and the ground in places would have been pretty hard, pretty frozen, really. There weren't much growing here. Purely because it had been scoured out by the glaciers, but there would have been a landscape of gravel and boulders, and that's really interesting because if you own an allotment or if you have a garden right down towards the River Severn, you will find a huge amount of pebbles in there, and that is actually glacial deposits that has been thrown out of the glaciers as the glaciers started to move further north, as they start to dissolve or melt as such, really. If you go to the City Museum and Art Gallery, you'll also find some huge boulders in there, and we know they are also from the glaciers, and it's those that would have carved out the Severn Valley, the landscape, the geography that we have today in the city centre, for example. So what did it carve out? Well, interestingly, we have a spine that runs along there that will eventually become the high street. Basically, it's the highest bit of land, and that land directly below it really has tons and tons of glacial deposits, so lots and lots of gravel basically and boulders that have been thrown down, and that gives a spine. And it's interesting because if you go in places like Marks and Spencer's, if you go through the high street door, when you come out through the Shambles door, you do end up having to go down steps, and that's because the land slides down to the east away from what is now the high street. So that spine, the land slides down away from it, and this area out here would have been pretty marshy. There was a lot of marshland in this period as well, where the glaciers had waterlogged the land, and as the ice and the snow and the frost below the ground starts to melt, you get a lot more boggy ground. So it would have been pretty boggy, especially around here. And this was a traditionally boggy area right up to the building of the 1815 Worcester to Birmingham Canal, really. The land also falls off to the west as well, and there's no marshland to the west, but it falls down to the west and down to the River Severn at the bottom. And you see that if you stand at the top of Copenhagen Street, for example, and look down towards the river, or you walk through the Crown Gate shopping centre, you end up going down a slope. So there's our glacial deposits that's carved out our landscape. So that is the spine. That's going to become the high street, and like I said, the land will slide off both sides. It's also a lot lower at this end than it is at this end, and that is where the cathedral gets built, or where the earliest settlement in Worcester is born, basically. So that's higher ground up there, and a perfect example of that, or a perfect way of seeing that, is if you walk along the riverside, look at the cathedral. You have to look up at it. That's because that's high ground, that's low ground, and the spine runs through the centre with the land falling off at either side. Now, in this period, we have animals starting to appear right on the edge of habitable land, remember, and they start to move down to the riverside because they need water as much as humans do. And as time went by, there was shoots of little trees and bushes and shrubs and even grasses starting to come through. So not only are they going to drink from the river, they're going to eat this fresh, very, very tender grasses that are starting to come through. And the animals in the area of Worcester City would have been a little bit different than the odd pigeon that we get today eating the odd chip down by the riverside. It's quite interesting because we would have had, for example, woolly mammoth plodding their way through in herds. We would have also had woolly rhinoceros. We've got evidence of those within Worcestershire. We would have had herds of reindeer. Bison, for example. Reindeers, there's no reindeers in this country anymore, apart from one herd near in the Cairngorms, for example. They've long gone, and obviously the woolly rhinoceros and the woolly mammoth have long gone, fully extinct, mainly because of climate more than anything, but as well as being hunted to extinction, like most animals are. You would have also had everyday deer that we still get today, wandering about. We also had moose or auk, depending on where you're from, depends on what you want to call those, really. And one of my favourite animals has to be the aurochs, which is like a giant cow, which I have mentioned before when we were taking a look at cattle, I think it was we were talking about. So we have these giant cows wandering about on the landscape, and if you're looking for smaller animals, we would have had things like hyenas, believe it or not. We would have had wolves, packs of wolves, and then even smaller animals like the beaver chewing through the trees in the marshes or along the riverbank. So it would have been quite a nice landscape. It'd be really, really good to actually go back to that sort of a landscape, really. It'd be quite interesting to see. But as those animals were coming down to eat, we've got the old food chain going on here. So they're eating things like the grasses or smaller mammals. They're also drinking from the water. And then the greatest predator of history, the human, is also starting to appear. And I've got some little postcards here that was done by the Worcestershire Archive and Archaeology Service, and I think they're absolutely fascinating things, and they give you an idea of what this landscape was like. Now, these are drawn and painted by a man called Steve Rigby, who is a fantastic artist, and this shows the Paleolithic period in Worcestershire. So that's a sort of site that you would have seen in Worcester at the time. So no McDonald's, no Guildhall, no high street shops or anything like that. It would have been a complete tundra landscape, and therefore if you have a close look at it, you will see marshland, you will see pools of water, you'll also see some snow and ice on there, because like I said, we were not under the glaciers. That was at Wolverhampton, but it was pretty cold. It was a cold climate, basically. You'll also notice we have the hunters, these Paleolithic people, using nothing more than sticks sharpened to a point, or even flint pointed spears, and they're wearing the animal skins because they need to keep warm. So that is Worcestershire, or Worcester, in the Paleolithic period. But people were just moving through. They were using what we would now call Worcester City as a hunting ground as such. Then, when we get a little bit warmer, in the period that is often referred to as the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age now, people start to come together in groups, and they decide to stay in one place for a lot longer. And it's very much like the Native American people, really. They will move and follow the animals. So if there's a herd of reindeer in Worcester or some woolly mammoth nearby, they will put up little huts and live there for weeks or maybe even months, and then when those animals wander off, they will move with them. It was a nomadic lifestyle, hunting and gathering. So here we have another Steve Rigby image, and it shows the Mesolithic period, and as you can see, there's a little hut in the background. And they're temporary huts, really. They're the equivalent of tents, and they're made out of things such as wood, animal skins, and they could also use the animal bone, like woolly mammoth bone, for example, leg bones, things like that, or even the tusks. And they are living, but they know that they have to move on when the animals do. And this is all around about 10,000 BC. And archaeologically, in the archaeological record, in places like Green Hill or even the London Road area or Bath Road, we have actually got evidence of these people there, mainly in flint objects, scrapers, spearheads and that type of thing. But then around about just after that period, we then get the Neolithic, and people are really, really thinking now about putting down roots. But we know no one did in Worcester. The first time we get a settlement in Worcester is around about 700 to 750 BC. And this is the period where we stop using flint en masse. And I say en masse because we still use flint in the Bronze Age, but we're now using the new metal called bronze. And as you can see from my little map here, what they end up doing is putting in a settlement, a small settlement of roundhouses. Where do they choose? On that high bit of ground scoured out at the end of the last ice age. By this period though, by the Neolithic and definitely by the Bronze Age, this whole area had started to become very green. There would have been lush grassland everywhere, moorland, and you would have also seen a huge forest that would have stretched through most of Britain at that time. And in the Bronze Age, they're having to clear that land. They are turning over the land to farming. They're chopping the trees down to build their houses, for example. And that is really where we're going to to end our little video tonight, because that is the early history of Worcester, which I think is absolutely fascinating. It's where everything starts that makes the city that we love today. Anyway, that's been an introduction, by the way. If you want to find out more, have a look online. Like I said, Explore the Past is a good place to go. Pop along to the museum, maybe get a book out the library and have a good look at that as well. Anyway, on that note, stay safe and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye bye.